My pleasure to introduce Patrick Veroneau today, our speaker. Pat is the founder of Emery Leadership Group, and he hosts a weekly podcast called Reimagining Leadership. He has a master's in organizational leadership and has trained extensively in the areas of emotional intelligence, influence, and personality. He has focused his career on helping individuals, teams, and organizations reimagine what it means to lead and succeed on a more conscious level. Pat is a member of the Harvard Business Review Advisory Council and the National Speakers Association, and he's also an adjunct instructor for SMCC. I will, when Pat goes through his stuff, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will facilitate the questions at the end of Pat's presentation. So I will go off video now and turn it over to you, Pat.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I'm actually going to go off video as well, so stay tuned. I will be here. So this is actually a workshop that I've done for several of my clients, and this was probably the first time was about 2 months ago as we started going through this. And this is based on a workshop that I've done for a number of my healthcare clients back in the fall of last year. And this was a longer workshop around navigating stress. And you'll maybe thinking, well, the why and how of becoming a resilient leader, what does that have to do with stress? And hopefully by the end of this, you'll, I think, have a better appreciation for how these two things go together. So as Tom mentioned, I started my business back in 2008, which many can remember. That was our last financial crisis. So I'm somewhat familiar with how this goes. My background is in emotional intelligence. I use a specific model that was created by two researchers in Australia called Genos. And I also am involved quite a bit with DISC and also with the 5 dysfunctions of a team through, many might know the book, Pat Lencioni. There's a series of workshops that I will do and assessments around that. And then last is with influence, and in particular, a model that I was trained under was with Robert Cialdini, who is probably one of the world experts in influence and has a number of books that are well worth the read in regards to understanding, I think, influence as well as irrationality. And here's just some contact information. If anybody wants to reach out to me after this to ask any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything. And as well, I have a company called Emery Leadership Group, and then just co-founded a new organization called Candor Development Solutions. So objectives. Why is developing resilience important? We'll talk about the biological, psychological, and social aspects of this human stress response, and it is a response. We'll talk about the impact that this has physically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, how this becomes a contagion and the impact that has. And I think we're certainly seeing that now, this contagion effect. So we'll talk about that. And then I think most importantly, as well, as how do we improve resilience? Understanding coping strategies, what we can do, what damages our resilience. How do we leverage emotional intelligence? And then lastly, there's a model that I created called Power, or a journal that provides really 5 activities, and it's based all on research. One that I leverage quite heavily is by a gentleman named Sean Aker, who's a researcher out of Harvard, who actually conducted what was called the 21-Day Happiness Challenge, and we'll speak to that. So firstly, the why, right? If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you're a leader. You can see here that I have it attributed to John Quincy Adams. It is actually attributed to Dolly Parton. So although John Quincy Adams oftentimes gets the credit for this, it can go back and be traced to Dolly Parton. So I actually need to change this here. I thought this was the updated one. So, but again, when we think about this from our own ability to navigate stress, it does have an impact on those around us, that the better we are at being able to navigate this, it does inspire and provide confidence in other people. How do we do this for them as well? I think also what's important here, the why. Leaders are learners. In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. This is a quote that I've been using for a decade now from Eric Hoffer, And if ever there was a relevance to this quote, it is now, because I don't think anybody would argue that we are certainly in times of change. And the only way that we are going to be able to navigate this successfully is to treat ourselves as learners. And I mean that from every aspect of questioning not just what one person says or one news outlet says, but really taking the time to say, I need to be a learner on this and really find out for myself. So the origins of stress, right? The CDC has a definition of stress. Most of us are very familiar, if you weren't before, of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, right? The harmful physical and psychological responses when job requirements don't match capabilities, the resources, or the needs of the worker. And most are experiencing one of those, if not all three. What I think is important to speak to here as well is that it should not be confused with challenges or what's called eustress. There is distress and eustress. They're not the same. Distress is when we don't manage stress. Eustress is when we actually find ways to leverage that stress that we're in for growth opportunities. So we talk about how stressed are we. Here's another study. This was from American Psychological Association. It was a survey that was done. The title of it was Stress in America, Paying with Our Health. There were 3,068 that were surveyed in this, 2014. They looked in 4 areas: work, money, family, and health. Now, I've only got 2 listed here, but I'm guessing that if we were to do this survey today, all 4 of these probably would be very high. So 60% of those that answered this survey said that work stress was significant. 64% said that financial stress was significant. What's important here too is this next bullet that says emotional support mattered. 43% of those without support said that over the last year that their stress had increased. And that also 43% coincidentally said that they'd experienced depression over the past year. Now we can contrast that with 26% that said that they did have emotional support of people around them. Those are the numbers that said that it actually had increased over the past year. So it had increased, but not as much. And that 30% of those that had emotional support said that they were experiencing depression. What's important here is this was actually a piece of data that was actually published by Express Scripts, and they're a pharmacy benefits company or prescription organization that fills prescriptions. Now, what they did was they looked at data between mid-February and mid-March, and you can see here in terms of the increases. Anti-anxiety meds increased in terms of prescriptions being filled 34%, antidepressants were 18%, anti-insomnia drugs were 14%. Clearly, we have an issue here in regards to how are we dealing with this, the challenges that we're facing. What's important here to also recognize is this is a study that was conducted that looked at really what's called a meta-analysis. And they looked at the association between psychological distress and mortality. Individual participants were pooled. There were 10 studies that were sort of pulled together. The conclusion here is that psychological stress is associated with an increased risk of mortality from several major causes in a dose response. So meaning the higher the stress, the more at risk you are. And even at low levels of distress, we saw this. The impact here is to say that what they looked at was cardiovascular disease, smoking, had similar mortality, rates of mortality or risk of mortality as stress does. Now we know the impact that isolation has in creating stress, and the environment that we're in is an environment that is this pressure cooker for stress. What are some of the associated diseases with stress? Again, this isn't to say that if you have stress, you get all of these things, but there's a link that has been demonstrated between stress and each of these that is listed here. And there are actually more. Now, from our own behaviors, I talked in the beginning, this quote by Dolly Parton around if your actions inspire. Here's the impact that leaders have on those people that work for them. This is one that I use oftentimes when I do work around emotional intelligence, the contagious leader. And what they did was they had 189 participants, 56 groups. Nobody knew what they were going to be evaluated on in this study that was done. But what they then did was they took the leaders of those groups and actually induced them into, as you can see here, either a positive or a negative mood prior to working with their groups. What they experienced was that those that were induced into a positive state, those members basically felt as though their mood was better, their feeling toward the group was better, their actual productivity was better, and the reverse was true for the negative group. That those managers that were in a negative state, when they came in, there was less association with the group. There was more impact on the individual group. And again, when we looked at it in terms of their ability to expend effort or do the tasks, that those were lowered in that group. And right, our moods matter. How we show up is important. And if we're stressed, we know that we can take that out on other people. And there's a contagion to that, a negative contagion. So the last thing that I'll mention here, this was a Harvard Business Review article, and I've only touched on a couple of these. There are 3 slides, and they're just based on quotes from this Harvard Business Review article, which was March 26th. It says, while medical and public health leaders are working as hard as they can to control the spread of the novel virus, experts in emotional intelligence also have something powerful to offer, a way to help us manage a different type of contagion that if we let it run rampant, will only make things worse. And we're certainly seeing that now. Our inability to manage either our own or somebody else's emotions is really going to be very, very detrimental. So the next is, it's easy to become infected by the negative emotions of coworkers, the newscasters you're watching, friends on social media, or your family. In effect, you catch their anxiety and transfer it to others, who relay it back to you in an almost unending circuit of negative emotion. And then lastly, reducing negative and bolstering positive emotional contagion will help us all weather this very unpredictable storm together. Before this webinar started, we were talking about really what I would say is an underappreciation for how stress and isolation are impacting our ability to navigate, I think, at the detriment of our own health. That here we are trying to avoid catching a virus, and we're presenting an environment where we're actually creating that ability to happen when we reduce our own immunity because of the stress that we put ourselves under. So what are the causes of stress? We'll talk about this from 2 different perspectives. One is external causes, family, work, economics, school, major life changes, unforeseen events, right? Isolation. I think if we were to be talking to each other one-on-one, I think most would agree that all of those are coming into play right now. Then we look at internal responses. What do we do with this, right? Our worry, fear, attitudes, unrealistic expectations, past experiences, what we might be reading about what's going on. At its core, when we look at stress, really it's a perceived lack of control. When we don't feel as though we have control over something, it elevates our level of stress. So when we look at it in terms of signs and symptoms of stress, we can look in 4 different areas: cognitive, behavioral, emotional, physiological. So the cognitive, right? We know that when we're stressed, there's ample research that says we have decreased concentration. We don't remember things as much. Behaviorally, we become more irritable, we can withdraw, we can be more aggressive or violent. Emotionally, we deal with fear, anxiety, depression, fatigue. And then physiologically, increased blood pressure, heart rate, respirations increase, sleeping issues, and then again, decreases in our ability to fight off infection. Our immune response actually becomes impacted with stress. And there is ample evidence that this is the case. So what do we do about this? There are a couple different coping approaches. One, we could look at it in terms of positive, one we can look at it in terms of negative. So the first one really is about responding. This is more of a long-term approach to learning how to cope. Whereas the negative is really about reactionary. It's about short term, what do we do right now, that in the long run, that actually can cause more issues for us. So this is a pretty solid listing of ways that we can create positive coping. So the first one, realistic expectations, right? Setting expectations in terms of realistic goals. Also recognizing that there are going to be bad days, that we need to understand that and plan for that. That's not to say that we don't expect that things are going to work out, but we need to also recognize that there are going to be days that are going to be stressful or aren't going to go our way. And when we can plan for those, they don't hijack us, which leads me into that third line there where it says, remain positive while planning for challenges. And many might remember Sully in US Air. He's the one that put the plane down in the Hudson River. And when he's asked, how did you do this? He simply says that that's what we trained for. That's why I didn't sound worked up when I was going back and forth with the tower, the control towers, because we planned for this. The next is around routine. And for those that are maybe not used to working at home or they've got kids at home as well, a routine is so important that not staying in our pajamas or sweatpants or not getting dressed for the day really can mentally impact our ability to be effective. Limit news streaming. That I was just speaking yesterday, I did an interview for a podcast with the author of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series, Mark Victor Hansen. He just wrote a new book called Ask. And as I was interviewing him for the podcast, we were talking about news. And he said he makes the recommendation to limit the consumption of news to no more than 15 minutes a day. That's it. You don't need to know any more than that. And that's certainly, I would agree with that. I think the more we listen to the news or read articles, the more we feed into this, it becomes a negative contagion. We don't need to know all that. I certainly see it now is that there are so many individuals that have just become overwhelmed by this and not been able to look more holistically at what are some of the other things that are going on here. So we look at reframing, right? Change the way you look at things. How will I get stronger from this? As opposed to why is this so challenging? Journaling is an important one, and we'll talk about that later in terms of the power journal. We move on to nutrition, the importance that has in terms of what we eat, what we feed our body, how that plays into our ability to deal with stress. Water consumption is so important here. And one of the interviews that I had on the podcast was with a personal trainer several months ago, and he gave this calculation for the amount of water that we should be drinking. 0.6 times your body weight equals the number of ounces. So somebody that weighs 200 pounds should be drinking almost a gallon of water a day. Next is relaxation. Again, we'll talk about this more in a little bit, but everything from learning relaxation techniques, mindfulness techniques, and then this idea of finding your happy place. So important. And again, we'll talk about it again. And then lastly, discussing the problems, right? Utilize existing social supports to be able to reach out to people. FaceTime, Zoom, Skype, taking walks with individuals, just picking up the phone. We need outlets. And we know that when we talk about things and we verbalize them, it reduces the level of stress that we will have when we name the things that we're dealing with. Moving on to the negative coping, right? These are things that we want to avoid, right? So avoidance itself, withdrawal. So when we think about isolation, that in and of itself can cause issues in terms of elevating our level of stress. Negative attitudes, right? Creating a contagion. Anger outbursts becomes a lack of self-control. Alcohol, drugs, we know that in the long run, those are depressants. Negative self-talk, it's never going to get better. The questions that we ask become so important in terms of what we look for. And that's what this whole book that I had mentioned, this Mark Victor Hansen had written. The book was called Ask. And the idea behind this was that when we ask the wrong questions or focus on the wrong things, that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The next is resentment, right? It's your fault. It's the government's fault. It's somebody else's fault. When we live in that world, it only create stress. Rarely is it going to cause any or create any solution. And then lastly is violence. So when we talk about, I'll key in on just a few of these. One is social support. So belongingness research. I do a lot of work in this space. We know how important it is, right? In terms of belongingness. The research is so strong there. Social support has a profound effect on life expectancy. Isolation and poor social support are associated with poor stress response and despair, which is what we're talking about, right? This isolation that we're dealing with really can have a negative impact. It's counterproductive at times. Patients have better outcomes with strong social support. And then this last one, few hardy individuals go it alone, and eventually they perish. If there's one thing that I believe is become more relevant coming out of this is this exposing of the self-made, that there is no such thing as self-made, that we need each other. Unless you birthed yourself, you created your own clothing, you grew your own food, built the roads that you travel on, the vehicles you drive, the house you live in, all the way down. We need each other. We will not get by without each other. And that's what belongingness research talks about, is that we need connections. We are pack animals at our core, that we need each other. And just like thousands of years ago, if you voted somebody outside of the tribe, you isolated them, that was a death sentence. And we're seeing it today. It's when people are isolated from groups, they're pushed outside of that tribe, then it has a different type of death, but it is still a death. So I'll mention just one part of cognitive behavioral therapy here because I think this can be very helpful. It's called using the thought record exercise. And what this does is it forces us to pause, to take whatever that negative thing that we're thinking about and really try and unpack this thing, right? So what is the evidence that my automatic thought is true or untrue? Now, I would challenge you, stick to the untrue, because we believe this so that why do I want to justify or validate that it's true? I want to look for reasons why what I'm thinking about is not true. What's the worst, best, and most realistic thing that can happen? Could I live through it? What's the bigger picture? Am I thinking in all or nothing terms? I think that's a big one. What can I do to solve the problem? Another important one. And then what's the difference that this will make or have in 2 weeks, 10 years, and you can change the days there, right? To months, to weeks, whatever you want to do. Lastly, I want to talk about this power journal. And again, this is based on a lot of research. One in particular called the 21-Day Challenge by Sean Aker, but each one of these has additional research behind it. And what this 21-Day Challenge did was it looked at 5 activities that it asked individuals to do for 21 days. The first one was, you can see here, I call it praise. It was about gratitude, that every day the participant had to write down 3 things that they were grateful for. And the challenge was to have them be different every day. Every day it had to be different. So for the first 3 to 5 days, right, we can do that. But when we get to day 15, now we're at 45 different things that we're grateful for, that we've had to think about. To me, that's where the power and the value of this comes in, because too oftentimes we think of how things are not going well. And what this does is it forces us to look at things are going, there are more things to be grateful for than we really first would expect. The next piece of this is around the others. And in this 21-day challenge, they were asked to do something for somebody else every day. Now, there's a lot of research around purpose and well-being and what that creates, which this journal speaks to, but that's it. Whether it's picking up the phone and calling somebody or sending a note to somebody saying, I want to let you know how much I appreciate what you've done or who you've been in my life, whatever that might be, how important this is. Or maybe it's in line at coffee and you buy the person behind you their coffee. The next one is at the end of the day, from an activity standpoint, people were asked to write down 2 to 3 sentences or for 2 minutes every day, what went well for the day. Now, if we think about this from a standpoint of gratitude and the praise first, we start our day out thinking of 3 things we're grateful for. We end our day thinking of what went well for the day. Right before we go to bed, we're putting ourselves in a positive state. The next was around exercise. And what it was recommended was that participants get at least 10 minutes of exercise a day, the minimum. That was it. Now, there's research that's in this Power Journal, which you'll all have the opportunity to get, that in this, when they did the exercising in one of the studies that I reference in here, was patients that had been diagnosed, clinically diagnosed with a major depressive episode. And what they did was they had participants in 3 different arms of this study. One was they exercised 3 times a week for 30 minutes. The next group, they had to exercise 3 days a week for 30 minutes as well, but they were also given an antidepressant called Zoloft. And then the last group was they were taking Zoloft alone. Now, at the end of 4 months, the exercise group alone did better than the other 2. And at the end of 10 months, when they followed up, the exercise group alone did the best. Now, that's not to say if somebody's on an antidepressant that you simply come off and you work out 3 days a week for 30 minutes, but it speaks to the power that exercise has in terms of activating many of the neurochemicals that we need to deal with stress and depression. Now, lastly was around relaxation. Participants were asked to find 2 minutes of quiet time each day. That was it. Not you got to levitate off the ground, just maybe focus on your breath for 2 minutes every day. Now, all of these things added up take up less than an hour of time in a day. That's it. And the benefits they can provide are far greater than that, and the research backs this up. So I took these 5 activities and created this acronym called POWER. And really, you think about this in terms of having a power day. That's what you try and do. You want to be happier, you want to build more resilience, then this is how you do it. And the research will back this up. So again, here's some activities that you can take, different ways that you can think of praise if that's a challenge for you. Other things that we can do for other people. It gives you ideas that you can do there, volunteer, look for ways to give to others, right? Here are just a small snapshot of what you'll find in this journal. The next around writing, right? Find the opportunity at the end of the day to reflect back on what went well for the day. Use it as an opportunity to visualize future success, positive experiences. From exercising, right, here it gives you some ideas in terms of what you can do, whether the goal is 10,000 steps. That's what I want to do for the day. There are so many different things that you can come up with in terms of exercise activities. And then relaxation. I speak quite a bit on this in terms of giving people different approaches that you can do. So here are a few mindfulness approaches that you can take, and I believe there's another page that I speak to here, and there's actually even more in the Power Journal of giving people different alternative ways to really just focus for 2 minutes, just different things that you can do where you almost, it's about slowing down and pausing. That's what these exercises provide us the opportunity to do. At the end of this journal, you'll see here what you can do is actually track your progress. Now, this is 3 months worth of progress. So every day I can say, did I do praise today? Did I do something for somebody else today? Even in the clinical trial that they did, or this trial, they didn't have to do it every day. They had to be consistent, but it didn't, if you missed praise 1 or 2 days, it didn't mean that you weren't going to be able to, receive the benefits. You were, and you did. Now, you can see here at the bottom, I've got it listed. If you were to go to the website that I have, Emery Leadership Group, you can, right as that site comes up, you'll have an opportunity to download this Power Journal. And as I said here, you're not going to be asked to buy anything. There won't be any call to action for you other than the call to action is to do this. That's it. That is my only call to action, is to try this for at least 21 days. And I promise you, if you stick with this, you will see the benefits. One of the things that I want to mention here is what's called the Jack Pine pine cone. This is an actual type of pine cone. I think it represents, I think, a lot of what people are dealing with today, and it's a way to think of this. Seeds of the Jack Pine cone, they don't release until they've experienced extreme heat, which usually comes through something like a forest fire. But once that happens, this new growth is possible. So you can see this picture here, it's charred earth all around, burnt pine cones. yet this seedling that's starting to pop up through the ground. Well, many today are experiencing, I'm sure, what feels like a catastrophic fire. That really the opportunity here, if you open yourself up to it, there is an opportunity here probably that many have never or will never experience because of this extreme situation they've been in. Now, you can either open up and look for how are you going to move forward from here, or this thing will burn you and completely destroy you. But we have that opportunity here. So as we review a few different things, right? Set realistic goals, exercise regularly, eat healthy, get adequate sleep. I know we didn't talk about that all that much, but certainly if we look at the research, it says that minimum of 7 hours a day is what we need. Maintain a work-leisure balance. Something, again, that in an environment where we might be working from home and living there and a lot of different things going on, it's even more important for us to be able to find ways to disconnect. Positive reframing, optimism, we talked about that in the thought record. Enhancing social support, finding ways to create belongingness is so important here. And then lastly is this challenge again about practicing the Power Journal, which you all have the ability to access if you're interested. What I've also provided here are some internet resources that you can have that really go through a lot of the data that I've compiled here. And then lastly, you can see I've got all references to the work that's been on here as well. So I'll stop there and open that up if anybody has any questions, observations that they want to make. And then lastly, I'll put my contact information up here again.
Hey, thanks, Pat.
You're welcome.
If you have any questions, please put them in the chat below, and I will be happy to facilitate the questions with Patrick. Pat, I was curious as you went through your Power Journal. I had to chuckle. It was 1 hour a day, which is fine. We say it is a little bit of time, but I've been chasing a client to schedule the next hour for 2 weeks, and he's something that he's paid me for, and he can't even find the time to schedule an hour to talk to me. So
yeah.
But I'd like to, if you will, talk about your experience, your personal experience with the Power Journal, and what's changed as a result of it.
So the Power Journal is something that I've done for a number of years now. I write, and I don't, actually, I think I have it right in the bag over here, is that every morning when I get up, I literally will write down in my journal, first thing I start out with 3 things that I'm grateful for the day. I'm grateful for X, I'm grateful for my family. It might be I'm grateful for my coffee this morning. Could be I'm grateful for getting up this morning and having another day. Also, it might be I'm grateful for a challenge that I'm dealing with right now. Because what I found is when I can be grateful for challenges that I'm dealing with, it takes that power away from that challenge on many levels. And it allows me to almost harness this thing to say, I'm going to overcome this. There's an expectation there when I take gratitude in that to say that it's helping me find a way to navigate this situation. We're all dealing with it right now in terms of how we work, right? There are challenges, but I do believe that if we ask the right questions, then there's a difference. So the other components to this are I run. I have a bike that I got a Peloton about 6 weeks ago, and I regularly schedule time to get on that. Mindfulness is something that I do in the morning. For me, that's when it works the best, is that after I do the gratitude and I journal for 1 page, I will then put on some type of brainwave app that I have, which is called Mindison. And there are tons of them out there if you were to go on the App Store. And I will set a clock for 15 minutes. And I will just visualize for what my day is going to look like. And we know there's so much research around the power visualization. It's not this hokey, kumbaya, sort of fluffy woo thing that athletes have been doing it for decades. That they understand our brain doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's made up. And there's lots of research that will back that up. So for me, it's why not visualize about how my day is going to work out in my favor, how I'm going to respond to things, where I'm going to go. It provides a sense of balance for me, and it builds resilience. So those are some of the ways that I use that Power Journal. Now, every day, do I run? Do I work out? No. There are days that I miss. There are days that I might miss on my journal. just for one reason or another, something comes up. But consistently, those are the things that I do. And I know I've received the benefit from those.
Cool. Thanks, Pat. I do have a question from Peggy Siegel, I believe that is. Let me scroll up. It is. So Peggy said that this is a great guide for individuals. Are you saying that a leader should express some of these solutions, or are you banking on that contagion piece for leaders/teams?
It's a great question. I think both. I think one, you need to be able to model these things, right? There's very little credibility when we tell somebody to do something that we don't take the time to do ourselves. Tom, you just asked me, what do you do? You just recommended these things. What do you recommend? What do you do yourself? I do that power journal. There's another caveat I will say there. As a leader, right, my job, I think, is my actions inspire others. The other part of this, and I remember this from one of the workshops that I was in by one of the instructors, and they said, unsolicited advice is worse than no advice at all. And that has always stuck with me, especially coaching, or when I was on the Center for Grieving Children, I was a volunteer there, a facilitator. Giving people unsolicited advice might not be what they want, but asking them permission. This is an area that I think, it feels like you're having a difficult time. Would you want any suggestions in terms of some strategies that you might want to try that might help you with this? So that's how I would approach that with any of these, is asking people permission. This seems like a difficult time. Is there anything that I can do to provide you that might help?
And I think, and you talked a lot about in the preface of this whole thing was about the times we're going through now, but I think a lot of the points that you talked about, Pat, apply to leaders at any time.
Without question.
And then this next question from Terry Johnson is relative to that. So Terry asks your comments on eustress versus distress. In my experience in corporate America, leaders often drive the levels of stress under the assumption that without it, performance will suffer. But workers often experience that as distress. Can you comment on how that disconnect can be addressed?
Yeah. So I'll go off of one behavior that I think is most important in terms of being able to separate those two, and that's around listening. That I would say, of all of the things that we are challenged with most, it's really being able to listen. And leaders, I think, struggle with that, or ineffective leaders struggle with that most, is that when you don't listen to either on four different ways. When I talk about listening, is listening with my ears. What is somebody saying? Tone of voice. Just by what somebody says and how they say it, you can tell, if they're stressed or not stressed, the more that you do this, or the more you interact with somebody. The next is listening with our eyes, watching body language, facial expressions, right? Being able to recognize when somebody is stressed, or they're anxious about something, is being able to read that. The next two are important too. One is stressed, or one is listening with our mind, and that's as we're listening to somebody else and they're telling us stuff, is to say, is what they're saying and is my interpretation of this, is this accurate? Maybe I need to clarify with them. You know what, Tom, what I'm hearing you saying is this what you mean, or am I missing the point here? Lastly is listening with empathy. And that's really trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes, right? So if I'm talking about driving somebody, right, that I'm going to create positive stress and we're going to do stretch goals or whatever, what if I was in that person's shoes? How would I want to be treated here? And is this really eustress? Am I trying to put this into this, it's positive stress, but it's really just a manipulation tool? And only the leader knows that. If they're just using, right, a stretch goal to manipulate somebody, as opposed to understanding that there really is a difference between eustress and distress. Eustress, if you have eustress, you've got somebody that bought into the challenge. If it's distress, then they don't feel as though they're capable of doing what you're asking them to do. The only way I'm going to know that is by listening.
Great. This is probably more of a comment and a corroboration of what you've talked about, Pat, this is from Bob Labrie. He said, gratitude works. My wife has written a Gratitude Day message every Wednesday for the last 11 years for her readers in our church. She started with 10 people and has had responses from Japan, New Zealand, and all over the US. Just being grateful heals.
It is amazing how much power that has. Now, there's an activity that we talk about in one of the workshops that I do around this, around resilience and team, and it wasn't my idea, it was one that I saw and I thought, what a great idea, is to write those things down on a piece of paper and you put them in a jar, the things that you're grateful for. And on days when things aren't going well, is you pull out and you read them, and it reminds you of better days that you've had. You're going to get there again. Might be that little piece that you need to get there. Reminder that things aren't always this bad.
Good. Thank you, Pat.
You're welcome.
I think a couple of the notes that I made in your CDC description, I thought was very apropos for today's environment. But it also talked about what we talked a little bit about, the leadership, whether it be good leadership or poor leadership, in identifying the capability and the resourcefulness and the needs of the workers. And I often work with clients on helping them understand the needs of their workers. Because if they don't understand their needs, then they can't be helping them grow and develop in their current roles.
Yeah.
And it's so unusual. I shouldn't say unusual. I can't believe how many times leaders miss that. They don't understand the needs of their workers.
Yeah, I think there's a lack of developing empathy when you deal with that. I just had this conversation 2 days ago with a director of a hospital that the almost verbatim said that if individuals don't want to work weekends, they chose the wrong profession. They need to find a different place to go. Now, that really demonstrates a total disconnect, and the conversation was very much around that. Even though he said, I don't tell people that, you don't need to, because you're thinking that, and that contagion in terms of how you address that individual will come out. And to say that you can't be in healthcare if you don't want to work weekends, it's not a productive way to be able to find out what somebody's real challenges are. Because that could be a person that just has a very high value for family, and for 15 years, they never had to work weekends, but now because of this virus and all these things changing, that their schedules are changing, that some have to. Okay, well, you need to be able to appreciate that before you can just say, well, you shouldn't be in this field because this is a field that is 24/7. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
It's the wrong approach.
Good. Another question, but Terry Johnson says thanks to your answer. But Peggy Siegel says that she's been having interesting conversations about the recent Michael Jordan docuseries. Some people think his relentless, almost bullying pressure on teammates helped the team succeed and become the best they could be. I disagreed with what motivates people. What is your opinion on this?
This is one of those ones. It all depends on where you stand on this and your experience. I am of the belief that there's a difference between people achieving what I asked them to do and really wanting to go where I want them to go, to be inspired to do that. And I think you can drive people to improve themselves, but it all depends on how it's done. So something that we didn't talk about much here is around radical candor. That radical candor could be, if I've got an issue with Tom, that I think his performance could be better, that the most productive way, as I see it, would be to have a one-on-one conversation with Tom around that, and set the expectation of Tom. You know what? I've seen what you can do, and I don't believe what I'm seeing now is your best performance. And I think you can do better. But also, is everything okay? Is there a reason why you don't seem to be hitting on all cylinders like you were before? Is everything okay? I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt first, that if I can do that, again, it's about listening now. Rather than just jump to the conclusion that you're slacking, you don't want to do this, maybe something's going on in the background that I don't know about. My own personal experience has been, and I've played sports ever since I was a kid, and I'm still a very competitive individual today, playing hockey and other things, that I find the best way that you get the best out of people is find a way to get them to want to go where you're asking them to go.
Mm-hmm.
Others could argue differently. That's just my own experience.
I would contend on Peggy's question, though, Pat, that times have changed. In Major League sports today, any of the sports, emotional intelligence is a lot more important than for the leaders than it was back in the 80s or in 90s when Michael was playing. So times have changed. I've contended for a while. John Farrell, for the former manager for the Red Sox, was not successful because he could not relate to the players.
Yeah.
Level.
And I would agree, times have changed. To that point, I had a CFO I was working with that was really a very difficult individual. People did not enjoy working for this person. And I worked with many of his staff and himself. And his response to me, and this was a decade ago, but saying, I don't really need to understand emotional intelligence as it relates to what I do, because I get results the way I behave now. And I couldn't argue with that. He did get results. What I knew was he didn't get the best results. And the data clearly backs that up. And really, that's what we're talking about. It's not to say that you won't get results, but isn't it about how do I get the best results? If we're really about succeeding in achievement, what's the best approach? And the research will back up that there's a better way to do this.
Exactly. Good. I don't see any other questions popping up. Pat, I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity.
But I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed your talk, and look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate it. Wishing everybody the best of luck, and hopefully we continue to move in a positive direction.